as we're doing that, kick off the session. Good morning, everybody. It's great to see everybody here bright and early. Looking forward to a lively hour. So I'd like to welcome everybody to the session entitled Strategic Investment Perspectives in the Evolving European and Global ATMP Landscape. As introduced by Ashley, thanks for that. I'm Phil Vanek, CTO and partner of Gamma Biosciences. We're a KKR partner investing in the private equity space as life sciences tools and technologies used for manufacturing in advanced therapies. A couple housekeeping items before we kick this off. I'll ask the speakers in a moment to introduce themselves and give a little bit of an overview of their organizations. I'll come back to that in a moment. This panel may present some forward-looking statements, but please don't accept that as investment advice and come hunting us later. We do plan to keep the conversation or the discussion very conversational, so expect everybody to go back and forth and hopefully engage the audience at some point before the very end of it. Finally, a quick note of thanks to the sponsors who have made all the drinks possible, and I hope all of us have enjoyed those. And please take some time to visit the exhibition hall and talk to the folks there as well. All right, so I know it's been noted that it's been 5 or 6 years that we were in Barcelona. We finally moved to Rome. It's great to be in Italy, the land of slow food and fast cars. I say that deliberately. We will be bringing some of those themes back in our conversation in a minute. We'll start by setting the table with a look at the recent economic trends as a framework to understand what's evolving in the ATMP landscape. Our entree will be an exploration of the similarities and differences between investors in the EU and around the world, as well as looking at some of the recent events in the last couple of years that have shaped the investment environment. Our main course will be a discussion around the types of investment that are attractive to our panel of investors today. How are they thinking about returns in the current and future environment? Finally, for dessert, we'll take a look at the future of investing. If cell therapy is the tiramisu and gene therapy the cannoli, we'll find out what the speakers are saving room for. So I'll try to keep my visibility to the background, and with that, let's tuck in and allow our speakers and panelists to make brief introductions. So, Lucia, please.
Thank you. First of all, thank you for the invitation. It's always a really great pleasure to participate to this meeting. I'm partner within Sofinnova Partners, that is a European investment firm with more than 50 years of history. We are focused on investment in life science, so medical devices, therapeutics, but also green biotech. We like to cover the full path of development of companies from the early stage all the way to companies that are getting to IPO or to bringing products to the market, which is the final aim of all the investments we do. Specifically, I am a partner within Sofinnova Teleton. That is one of the 7 strategies of Sofinnova Partners. The Sofinnova Teleton strategy is the only one that is focused geographically, so we invest 100% in Italy, and we have a particular interest for advanced therapies, also because we have a strategic partnership with Fondazione Teleton, that is an Italian charity that had already presence during this meeting in several panels, that is supporting research to find treatments for genetic disorders. So really glad to be here and really glad to look at the perspective on how advanced therapies could really develop in the next years.
Great, thanks, Lucia. Sven.
Thanks very much, Phil. Good morning, everyone. For some reason, I'm feeling inexplicably hungry. Can't quite explain it. So it's wonderful to be here. Lovely to be in Rome. What a fantastic, amazing city. So my name is Sven Keely, and I'm an investment advisor for SciSay Ventures. So a little bit about SciSay. SciSay is a boutique VC focused on developing therapies and bringing them out of Japan. So thank you, Rita, for emphasizing the Japan and the Far East side, because this is really where we're focused as Rita alluded to, and those of you may be aware, the Japanese infrastructure for cell and gene therapy product development is really not very advanced. There is some incredible science out there, but translating it into companies that make a difference to patients has been incredibly challenging, and even more so challenging has been getting those technologies out of Japan and making them available to the worldwide. And so really this is where SciSay is focused on. We focus on developing programs and companies within Japan and bringing them out using expertise from the West to bring company growth, development growth, expertise, capabilities. We also focus on companies at the moment in the US, but very soon in the near future also in Europe, that have a rationale to move to Japan. And we will be able to then help them and support them in moving to Japan. And so our approach in Japan is we have the Japanese Sovereign Wealth Fund as our largest investor, and that allows us to have a lot of benefits from a financing perspective, which we'll talk about in a minute. From my perspective, people that know me here, is I have been on the other side of the fence, and I've been an operator for in excess of 20 years. And a lot of time that I spent speaking to VCs and investors and trying to get them to part with their money, I noticed that the vast majority of them had business degrees and they came from a finance background, but they really didn't get cell and gene, and they didn't get some of the challenges, and they didn't get the importance of making these therapies available to patients. And so what I've done is made that conscious decision of poacher turned to gamekeeper and try and really go in to help build companies in a way that's much more thoughtful and beneficial to patients.
Great, thank you. Philip.
Yeah, hello. First of all, very excited to be here. Thank you for inviting me. So my name is Philip. I'm a senior analyst at Biovision Ventures, relatively small European life science-focused venture fund. So despite being a European fund, we're mostly focused on the investments in the US, but also, of course, also in Europe. So we are kind of really scientifically grounded team. Most of the teams are actually doing their PhDs and postdocs in life science. So me, myself, I consider as an RNA guy. So today I'll try to advocate for this field a lot. Basically, we are mostly focused on therapeutics, but also a small portion of the fund is dedicated to different, what we call bio-IT stuff. It's digital health, diagnostics, drug design, and related stuff. So we rely on very distributed team across the world. So me, myself, based in Israel, but we also have partners in Europe, in the United States, and a lot of advisors on both sides of the Atlantic. So probably it's very nice to meet you all.
Thank you. And Bo?
Yeah, thanks for the invitation to be here. It's a pleasure to be in Rome and representing the Novo Nordisk Foundation. So the Novo Nordisk Foundation is now the biggest philanthropic foundation in the world. It invests via Novo Holdings, and Novo Holdings owns Novo Nordisk. And because it's going well for Novo Nordisk right now, it's going well for the foundation. And the foundation then invests in human health, planetary health, and to further the ecosystem in technologies, and basically to drive whatever is needed to build these areas of human health and planetary health. And one of those initiatives that have recently been established is the cell therapy area at Novo Nordisk, which means that the Novo Nordisk Foundation Accelerator will do exactly what Sven just alluded to, help try and translate some of this fantastic science into clinical trials to kind of accelerate that journey and furtherly mature the ecosystem. I have a background, I have a scientific background. I have a background from Novo Nordisk, been there since 2011 in various R&D areas, and then also in strategic areas, and part of the stem cell leadership team there as well. So it's a pleasure to be here. Looking forward to the discussion.
Great, thanks. So I invite everybody to line up for our buffet of discussion topics, and we'll dive right in. So clearly the last couple of years have been arguably, economically challenging around the world, and certainly that has influenced the investment and the environment. Sort of a little bit of an IPO bubble in 2021, a little bit of shortage of capital available, which was perhaps thinking that it might start coming back. But looking back over the last couple of years, from the context of Europe in particular, and then going beyond that to a more global perspective, what are some of your thoughts? How has Europe been impacted directly? Maybe I'll start with you.
Thank you. Well, I think that the entire world has been obviously impacted by the big bubble that exploded in US. And I'm highlighting that it exploded more in US than in Europe because in US, generally speaking, there are much larger investment funds, and the fundraising at all the different stages are usually much larger. What I see in Europe is a more conservative approach also in terms of funding startups, and a more somehow capital efficient way of investing in biotech companies. So I think that Europe kept this advantage of buying an excellent science for a fair market value. This has been an advantage in facing the difficult economic situation of the last 3 years, three years. And it has been also able to show that with an efficient capital funding, you are still able to buy in also time to allow companies to reach the next step. And this has been the philosophy that also in Sofinnova we have kept. Once we make an investment in a company in which there is very good science, the good science is at the end attracting also funding. And therefore, we have been also backing up our portfolios, and this has proved wise, meaning that by the time now the market is ramping up, the situation is stabilizing. Actually, our companies with very good science have been able to move forward, and we have a prospective future of growth.
Right. Well, I'll come to you as well. And, you know, in Novo Nordisk, one of the largest investors generally, has had a very successful and very newsworthy past couple of years. What has your environment looked like over the last couple of years, and what have you seen shaping ATMPs in general?
Yeah, so I think, of course, we're in a fortunate situation being in that field that we are with diabetes, and that's been growing and kind of not touched by all the other things that have been going on a macroeconomic scale. So that's fortunate, of course. But still, the funds that have been invested, of course, been tied up because it has been difficult to exit, right? So there has not been a lot of free capital to invest in new opportunities. And so hopefully, we're already seeing that a little bit now, that there are some exits coming up, which means that there's freeing up, there's capital that's being freed up to invest again. So that's more kind of from a holdings perspective on the financials. From a philanthropic kind of scale, we're actually in a very fortunate position that we've been able to increase our funding substantially over the last few years. But of course, that's not enough on its own, right? We need to get those engines going that may have been halted a little bit over the last few years and see if we can get some traction again and free up some capital that can then be reinvested. Yeah.
Right. No, very sort of ambitious plans and environment to be working in. Philip, you invest from Luxembourg and really around the world, so maybe you can provide some context and compare and contrast what you're seeing around the world.
So obviously, when we're talking about the US, the major difference is just capital access for the companies. So I would start with like the most important thing, that the good companies are still raising no matter what. They're able to gain access to the capital. So I think that currently we see that polarization in capital access between different venture funds is getting even bigger. So being myself as a part of a smaller fund, it's getting harder and harder to compete with the large funds, with the mega deals, 100 million plus what we can see right now. So as for our strategy right now, we're trying to maybe adapt to this kind of environment by trying to catch the founders before they even know they're going to be a founder. So it's going to be harder to compete in the US if you're a smaller fund, even if you're a middle-sized fund in the future. So probably that's the main trend in terms of investment that we see right now.
In Japan, Sven, with the context of Japan and sort of the economic challenges there over the last couple of years, can you give a sort of an Asian perspective?
Absolutely, Phil. So I think at the end of the day, let's not get too focused down on one region over another region, because the global meltdown that we saw was global. What we saw, as everyone has said already, is the US seemed to be worst affected because that's where the most money is. Europe always tends to be a little bit behind the US, and so we saw that slowdown, which Lucia has already mentioned. And I think what we see in Japan is, because Japan is a much less mature investment market for cell and gene therapies at least, there was a little bit less of an influence there. There are much less VCs that are focused on the cell and gene therapy space, but those VCs that dabble in cell and gene and that are doing other things were affected just the same as everyone in the US and other places, where you had the LPs starting to pull back. Many of the LPs that are investing into these VCs are reliant on a certain percentage to go into the VC space versus elsewhere. And because they're also investing in public companies, when the values of those public companies go down, their relative holding value of their VC companies went up substantially, and that broke a lot of their rules internally, and that caused a lot of navel-gazing and concern, and that resulted in much less money flowing into the VC space. And so this has caused a lot of the slowdown and the challenges, and then we have things like increased interest rates, et cetera, et cetera. From Saisei's perspective, we were somewhat shielded in that, as I mentioned, one of our biggest investors is the Japanese sovereign wealth fund, and so sovereign wealth funds don't tend to pay that much attention to interest rate hikes and things like that. They tend to just plow on regardless, be that a good thing or a bad. So from our perspective, we had a very similar amount of freedom and flexibility to continue investing, but it's always done with the Western eye in mind. And so there is very much a newfound focus in investing at the moment in looking at companies. The FOMO has dissipated to a greater degree, and so we look with a much more specific lens into companies and company development compared to a number of years ago also. So I think we're seeing this general shift globally.
And Sven, you commented in your introduction about the experience of investors in the advanced therapy space. So not a sidewind ball here, but I'm just curious, has the last couple of years allowed the investor class to catch up and learn a little bit more? Or, how have people been spending their time?
To an extent, yes, I think it has. And, I'm not looking to be negative to any other, investment groups and things like that. There is really strong science in VC and investing groups. And, there's a really good understanding about science, what the challenges are with the science. And so there's very good questioning about that. And, if you are a company looking for funding and investors are asking specific questions about your science, there's a kind of a good reason for it, and you should be listening to that, and you should be paying attention. I think in my experience, what I found was the actual running of a company and how you structure the company and how you make a product and take it to a patient, that knowledge and understanding was kind of lacking. And so from the early stages, that wasn't such a big deal. But when we need to think about being much more capital efficient, getting into the clinic as rapidly as possible, how we are as effective at doing that as possible, and thinking about keeping that patient front and center and not getting too caught up in the shiny, bright, new scientific discoveries, but really focusing on not the science, but the product and the science that drives the product. I think this is where hopefully we're seeing some of the investor groups getting more of an understanding and an appreciation for what it takes to actually develop and run a company.
Right. Bo, you looked like you wanted to add to that.
Yeah, I just wanted to pick up on what you said, Sven, and also a little bit what Philip said about this investing in the early stages, right? And I'm you know, while it maybe some of the big investments have been kind of slowing down a little bit over the last few years, we've seen a trend towards maybe focusing a little bit on, so how do we help engaging this academic stage in this transition onto a more clinical phase, right? And getting ready for clinical trials. And I think a lot of you know, foundations but also VCs are engaging that in that aspect. And what's important here is to get it right from the get-go, right? To learn, to get you know, the team established, to get on the right path to the patients in the beginning so that you don't make those mistakes that previous groups have made. And there's a lot to do there to invest in that, both with regard to engagement, with regard to kind of helping them without sizable investments, but also with minor investments, actually, they can get quite far on that path already. So there has been a trend towards focusing on that, actually, over the last few years as well. I just wanted to comment on that.
Great comment. Shifting gears, okay, that's my first car analogy. Let's move to the current state of affairs in 2024. And I'll set this up. Tim Hunt, in his introduction yesterday, mentioned that 2023 was the year of gene therapy. 2024 is anticipated to be the year of cell therapy. So what's on the menu for 2024? Anyone?
I think definitely cell therapy, but I don't think just plain vanilla cell therapy. I think we are moving towards understanding biology much more effectively, and we're starting to think more about engineering. So I would say it's engineering cells, and that could be, you know, iPSCs, it could be editing, it could be multiplexing. I think there are a variety of things, and that engineering allows us to move into different areas. I think, you know, we can use that engineering in using mRNA as our payloads, and how we engineer that mRNA in and we get it into the body. We can do it thinking about in vivo approaches. We can do it thinking about better allogeneic approaches. You know, we haven't really cracked that allo nut fully yet, despite what everyone says we have. So I think, yes, cell therapy, but I think it's the engineering of the cells, and also the transport modalities. I'm not going to call them vectors, because we've got so many different ways of getting the good stuff into the effector cell, be it outside the body, inside the body, wherever. So I think engineering for me is kind of the overarching focus.
I think that as an overall, we need as investors and to work together with academics, with companies, with biotech companies, with CDMOs, to really make the full process from the basic research all the way to the patients really effective from also a sustainable point of view, sustainability point of view. Cell and gene therapies have reached the patients and have shown that they are the new paradigm to potentially cure diseases. But they are facing problems in terms of sustainability once you move from rare diseases to more common diseases. And the rare diseases are still not so much appealing for, you know, returns, for real economic returns. So we need to work together, and ARM is really instrumental from this point of view. Also with the involvement of regulatory authorities to make this process smoother, and to reach a point in which we actually make these therapies really available globally, meaning US, Europe, Eastern countries, with the needed knowledge and with a price and a timing that is sustainable. So this is actually not something that we will be able to reach in 1 year, but I'd love to see this effort starting from this year.
Sure. Philip, what do you see
So I would like to add a short comment that, as Sven said, we also think that these engineered technologies are going to be the future. And specifically, we're mostly interested currently, I'm not talking about 2024, it's more about the future, but still. We are really interested in vivo remodeling approaches because we think that this could be a major groundbreaking achievement in the field. Currently, you can see some programs at preclinical stages trying to get different in vivo CAR T cells and other stuffs. I'm not talking about safety right now, but still we think it may be a major leap for the industry, transition to the in vivo remodeling on cells for like vast majority of indications.
Bo, any thoughts on your end?
Yeah, I think if you look at it from an investment perspective, we're in a situation right now where we're risk stacking significantly, right? We have a biological risk and we have a technological risk, which is a very, very big technological risk compared to, more traditional ways of developing drugs. So what I'm looking forward to is actually within the regenerative medicine field to start to see some of the clinical data on the biology, right? There are some clinical trials already ongoing. In different indications where we'll start to see some readouts about, so what are the efficacies of some of these types of allogeneic therapies that could be the first wave of regenerative medicine therapies. And that, to me, is going to be very, very interesting to follow and see that data coming out.
Yeah.
Well, if I could just add, maybe kind of to bring a lot of the thinking together, we sit here and we sit in a very wealthy Western country, and we invest in other wealthy Western countries. And most of us come from and live in wealthy Western countries, and we have access to these cell and gene therapies that if we absolutely need them, doesn't matter which country you live in, if it's Europe, the UK, the US, if you get one of these dread diseases or your family gets it, you can get access to that therapy. Even if you have to pay a lot and you have to mortgage your house, depending on where you live, you can still get it. And I think we as an ecosystem and an environment need to be thinking about how do we develop these therapies so they're not just available to us in these wonderful, wealthy countries where we can sit up on a stage and we can pontificate about how wonderful we are and how great we are and how wonderfully we're developing therapies for patients, because we're developing them for a very small percentage of the world's population. Let's not be shy about this. We need to be thinking about how do we develop these therapies for patients in East Africa, for patients in Southeast Asia, for patients that have to walk 3 days to get access to a therapy. These are really life-changing therapies. And I think as we think about developing these new therapies and the engineering and the end-to-end technologies and moving from rare to common diseases, we need to think about how do we do this in a sustainable way that we can actually do some good for the world as opposed to our very privileged, rich countries.
How often does that come up? I mean, you're talking about two things, cost of goods and pricing. And manufacturing has always been top of mind for everybody. But when you're looking at making an investment in a therapeutic asset, is that the tip of the spear for you to ask the question about manufacturability, cost, deliverability, access? Maybe I'll start with you, Bo. I'm just get your thoughts.
And more, I think, I think there have been a lot of learnings on the first wave. Now I'm talking to cell therapies about mistakes that have been made and things that have had to be redone. So a lot of cycles, iterative cycles, where you have to change things along the way. That's very, very expensive, right? So that's part of driving the cost up. And it's not even just getting to clinical trials, it's also transitioning between the different phases of clinical trials. And then not even speaking about getting to market and scaling to market, right? There are many things that we need to solve. I completely agree with Sven. Of course, being in a foundation like where I come from, that's the ultimate purpose. Let's bring this to as many patients as possible, right? That would be fantastic. It's a bit of a ways out, but I think a lot of the things that we're actually solving now will help drive that, price down, and that will provide access gradually, right? But it's a long journey ahead.
It takes a lot of capital to bring a therapeutic product to market, and as you're infusing cash into the ecosystem and you're lining up the priorities of how people resolve some of these challenges, I guess, the obvious question is where or the wins, how does that shape your investment theme? You know, do you go for technologies that might not be as innovative, might be going after a larger indication cohort, something, you know, I'm just curious, a pulse of the panel on what's most important?
I think from our perspective, we think about, you know, what are the therapies that are really going to shift the needle? So I'll give the example, you know, up until a few years ago, there were in excess of 56, I think it was, CD19 cars in development. And do we really need another CD19 car? I think, you know, most people have kind of gotten to the edge of that, and we know how efficient they are, and they're doing very well, and the ones that are out there are going to be so much better than the first ones. But we need to think about what is the therapies and what are the technologies behind those therapies that are truly going to make a difference. So bring the cost of goods down, be able to allow us to move and transport these therapies to different areas. I think, you know, we love, when we talk about the high cost of development and manufacturing, we love to blame just CMC and manufacturing. But let's not kid ourselves, that's not the only driver of large cost. You know, a lot of these things have a very strict cold chain. There are regulatory requirements in place that are still harking back to the small molecule days that don't necessarily apply to cell and gene therapies, that are not necessarily fit for purpose. And, you know, Tim mentioned some of the new changes that are coming into Europe in the future that probably are pushing us backwards as opposed to forwards. And so these are the things we also need to work against. So it's not just one thing. There, you know, as Bo said, there are a variety of different things that we need to think about. And we need to, as we invest, be thinking about how is this going to contribute to the greater environment going forward, because it's not something we're going to solve this year. But if we don't start thinking about it now, it's like climate change. If we don't start thinking about it now, we're never going to get there. So we need to think about how that applies to what we do today.
Yeah. It's a great opportunity to segue a little bit into one of the questions we had listed here. And in a recent Endpoints news article, the CEO of Astellas was just citing some of the legislative and regulatory reform proposed in Europe specifically. And he noted that, you know, Europe lags behind the US in particular in terms of speed to market or getting drug approvals, as well as the time for reimbursement. With the legislative forthcoming proposed legislative elections change in the EU, how's that going to influence ATMP investment in Europe?
That should be an effort that, as European citizens, we should really keep in mind for the next election. Again, Europe, if you look at the situation of advanced therapies in Europe in 2016, 2017, we were far in front of the US. We were doing great. Also in terms of therapies approved and reaching the market and with proper pricing and so on. We lost this advantage. And one of the reasons, I think, is because Europe is not really a union. And we need, once we have approval of a product, then to go back to each single state and negotiate pricing and cost. So we should really start thinking about Europe as a single country. And this should be the effort in several fields, including this one, with proper advocates that understand the field and that understand what is needed to be done in terms of legislation and regulation. That is really, you know, the hope in terms of how the country, the European country, could move in the future.
Philip, as a global investor, how does that disparity shape your or influence your investments?
Yeah, so actually it's a great point, because we're talking about European Union as a whole, but it's actually a completely different story. So you can get a reimbursement for gene therapy in Germany, for example, but you won't be able to get to it in other countries. So investors should consider it always, because when you go into US, it's basically the same inside of US. Of course, it's a smaller market, but it's not as fragmented as the European Union. So the biggest problem is probably the price, right? Because you have so many great products, gene therapy products, which are just withdrawn from the market because of a lack of a commercial interest. So I think it's like the first thing to do. And it's not only CMC, yes, or any other problems, but maybe sometimes science is just a little bit fantasy farther away than the people who are really doing the product. So it takes some time to get to that point when you are able to reduce production costs to tens of thousands of dollars. But probably just takes some time to establish these processes.
Oh, is that influencing your thought process as well?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, you know, altruistically, we would like to just provide these to patients, right? But in the beginning, reimbursement is a key lever to get these to the patients, right? So, and that's a challenge in Europe because you have to go to the individual countries. It's a big lift. So in reality, Europe is, for many investors, the big five countries where the big markets are. And so it's easier in the US because it's one market. Of course, there's the PBMCs, and it's another ball game with some of those things that are going on over there. But it is two different markets right now. And so what's going on also with the legislation in Europe right now, the discussions going on about data protection, reducing that further, which means that the time that you can have with exclusivity on market may be even shorter. Then, you know, there's some incentives that maybe are moving a little bit the wrong way in Europe. And, you know, at least for some of these more kind of risky therapies or products, I know that the EU is also talking about adding bonuses for some of these different types of more rare diseases and more difficult to produce and manufacture products. So in the end, it gives you an opportunity to get more exclusivity than you can get today. But it's all right now up in the wind a little bit at least, right? But the base kind of data protection is as it looks right now, is going to be shorter in the EU, and that may even actually affect the ability to bring some of these, or the willingness to bring some of these to the markets in Europe.
Also, on the other point that you were mentioning, the fact that the time to actually get approved to initiate clinical trial is usually longer also in Europe than US. We should think about this because, again, a lot of investors, US, when we syndicate, obviously are trying to push towards clinical development in US because of this. And again, it's a missing opportunity. We should be aware of this. Right. And we should work to educate political settings to modify this legislation and to make it more efficacious, more effective.
Yeah, yeah.
No, I completely agree, and I think, you know, Bo made a good point about some of the changes, and the problem that you really highlighted is there's all this discussion, will it, won't it, you know, and no one really knows which way it's going, and that is actually very damaging because developers are looking at that and saying, well, do we really want to go and develop in Europe if there isn't this clarity as to what we're going to get? I think there is the capability to get these products to the market quickly and to get them approved and reimbursed quickly. And, you know, Lucia and I worked very closely on Stromvelis, and Stromvelis was approved and reimbursed very, very rapidly initially. But we've seen things slip from there. We see the prices differ, and things have just sort of gradually worsened, sadly, where, to Lucia's point, the US has really moved ahead. But let's not forget that these things do go in cycles, and we need to remember that because 10 years ago, everyone was looking at Japan. Japan was the great possibility. iPSCs came out of there. They had their new innovation framework, you know, and then that dropped off, and Europe sort of took the lead, and Europe was the place where the cell and gene therapies were being approved, and the FDA was, quite honestly, for those of you that, you know, went to FDA meetings in 2013, 2014, they were pretty nasty. They weren't very friendly at all. And then we got some new leadership in and things changed, and now it's a great place to go and have meetings, and Europe has now slipped behind. So I think these things do go in cycles, and hopefully, you know, if we can create some competition between the regulators so that they can try and one-up each other, I think hopefully only the patients will benefit from that.
Sure.
Yeah, I just want to add to that about this uncertainty about where we're going. And you started by asking the question about, so how do you choose which products to work on or which indications to go for? And one way you can approach it, and which we can, of course, being in the situation that we are being a foundation, is to say, so where do we make the biggest impact kind of from a patient point of view, right? Which of these therapies will, get from a benefit point of view, right? Which patients will, how many patients will benefit from this therapy? What's the unmet need that we will kind of, help kind of solve by bringing this to market? Because the business case may be super, super difficult to calculate, right? Then at least you have that, as can say. And then have to believe at some point, if we're able to pull this off, there's someone who's going to be willing to pay because there is a huge need, right? Because there is so much uncertainty that it's very, very difficult to really calculate, the business case for a product like that. Yeah.
So, at the risk of smorgasbord of topics here, the last thing I wanted to touch on in this section was kind of this cost of capital and the risk capital and how it flows into investing. In particular, a lot of people have been keeping cash on the sidelines because zero risk to just keep the cash at high interest rates. On BBC this morning, they announced that the U.S. is indicating that they'll have a future rate cut in the not-too-distant future, and that should mobilize investments. Do you think in 2024 that's going to have an impact?
I think we can already see that the situation is changing, the landscape is changing. First of all, farmers are doing a lot of acquisitions. The reason is the patent cliff. They needed to refill their pipelines, and these exits are actually something that is corroborating any investment. So is creating already a positive loop from this point of view. So I think we are starting up, we are on the downhill, starting the downhill cycle, hopefully. And the first sign is the fact that M&A are becoming more and more interesting. In the field of advanced therapies, rare diseases are picking up, also because we should remember that also US is affected by the IRA, so everybody, all countries anyhow, have problems in this field, and rare diseases are somehow saved, and so are still appealing also for investors. Having said that, is more with approaches that are not cell and gene, because again, of the very high cost and the uncertainty on reimbursement. But this is paving the way to a future growth.
Your Becker sovereign fund was insulated from that a little bit, I presume? Or?
To an extent, yeah. But I think, at the end of the day, it tends to follow everything else. And so I think, what we're starting to see is some initial signs that things are improving. But, I think I'm not entirely convinced it's time to have a party yet. So, we've seen a few indicators. We've seen the XBI cross the $100 mark a couple of times this year. I think when I looked last a couple of days ago, it was hovering at 97, 98, which is a great improvement over the 60-odd where it was earlier. We're seeing some good follow-ons. We've seen some very large, as we'd heard just earlier, we've seen some large VC funds re-up, both in Europe and in the US, and I think that's very important. And I think lastly, we're seeing some good company investments. We've seen some big Series A's. We saw, there was a 200 million announced yesterday. There's been a 180, 400 million. So there have been some really big announcements. So that side, I think, is positive, and it's pushing forward to showing signs of recovery. I think on the other side of it, there are still a lot of companies out there that are struggling to get finance. And there are going to be a lot of companies out there that are still going to fail throughout this year. And I think that's just part of the way things work. I was speaking to someone this morning, and they said last week they were approached by 4 CEOs who have all lost their jobs recently. I've been speaking to a company that was, on paper, is valued over 150 million, and they're still 3 years away from the clinic, and they're looking at 90% discount rate just to get enough money to keep going. So I think from the developer and the startup perspective, the pain hasn't ended and won't end for a while yet, probably not until the end of the year at least. And for a lot of companies, the pain is going to get worse before it gets better.
Yeah, and a consequence of that is obviously cash conservation, operationally extend runways. Philip, is that what you're advising your portfolios?
So first of all, I will pay a lot to know if there's going to be a Fed cut, but we're living in a certain world. So I would say that I said previously, but still great companies are able to raise money. Maybe right now, because of all of the problems, there is a higher threshold for hard data that company can generate. So you could come like a few years ago, see some nice data, it would be more than enough for 100 million round. But now everybody wants their NHPs, wants everything. So probably really good companies, innovative companies are still going to raise no matter what, but they have to focus on this like really hardcore scientific data to prove VCs that this is really exciting. And also, we do expect that M&A market may support this field a lot because we see some interest to the M&A specifically because of a pipeline of different big pharmas, but it's another topic, yes. But we think M&A could really help the sector for the next few years.
Sven, you raised it on one of our introductory calls, this concept of seeking alternative sources of cash, so foundation funding as well as grant non-dilutive fundings. You know, Bo, do you have a comment? Is this influenced your selection?
Yeah, I think it depends a lot on also at what stage the companies are at, how much they're affected by the economic situation, the current economic situation, right? Because if you're investing in kind of on a late stage company, then the interest rates that are going down may, give you an ability to get more funds because some limited partners will be more attracted to that type of investment than putting their money in the bank and just taking the 5%. So that's a good thing. Maybe more cash will flow there. I think we still have some issues about the earlier stages that are not solved by that. The risk is that, or the reality is that you're looking, at least from some funds that are very focused on cell and gene, that it's a 10x kind of you're looking for in every company that you invest in, right? Because, so just an example, you invest in 10 companies in a portfolio, one of them just needs to carry the whole portfolio or have the potential to carry the whole portfolio, right? And that is not solved by shifting the interest rate by 2%, right? That is solved by having funds or investors that are focused on the CGT area and maybe have a whole portfolio of CGT companies and build a whole portfolio based on that. And we're not really truly seeing that dedication from investors yet, where you really go in and say, okay, let's just make a whole kind of investment in that field where the portfolio balances out, right? So I think what we are talking about now is that we maybe also need to start thinking about building some of those instruments with VCs that are wholly focused on this field as well, right?
Oh, great, very thoughtful sort of conversation. Obviously, we are time-bound and time-limited in our session today. So guess what? It's time for dessert. Look forward a little bit to see what the future might hold. And Lucia, I'm going to start with you. On your website, you were quoted with this, and I love this quote a lot. It says, "Recent history is telling us that we need to dare more." Sounds like something the Ferrari F1 team would say, but setting that aside, maybe you can comment on that in terms of what your hopes are for 2024, 25, and beyond.
Well, I think that, again, obviously the field is very much influenced by the big bubble that happened a couple of years ago. But having said that, the history is telling us that really we need to dare on something that is really innovative and can make a change in the development of therapies for the benefit of patients. And I think that on this one, venture capital should really wear the hat of those that dare to bet on good science, solid science, but also to be enough educated and enough on the technology and enough patience to allow the technology to reach the inflection point. So this is calling also for a way of investment in which you do seed investments with a capital efficient modality, but you are then ready to follow on and to support the company in the future steps of developing and being able to wait, because sometimes things do not really go as you are, as you planned, and you should be able to properly back up the companies. This is also one of the reasons why I think that it's important to see in Europe the growth also of larger funds and funds that are able to follow on companies at different stages.
Sven, what would you like to see coming in?
I think what I would really like to see is McLaren be more consistent.
Yes.
Probably from a cell and gene therapy perspective, I absolutely agree with Lucia. There is this need to be bold and to look forward. But I also, as coming from an operator perspective, I also think we need to remember that VCs are not just there as glorified piggy banks. That when you work with a VC, that VC should be adding value to your company. And so for me, it's about ensuring that that company is well set up, that they've got the right leadership, that that leadership is efficient, that they've got the backing, the background, and the experience, and critically that they have a board that is educated about cell and gene therapy and biotech. Very often we see, and I'm sure many of my colleagues here will see the startup companies, you've got a variety of people on the boards from different backgrounds that have no experience in cell and gene therapy or biotech whatsoever, and that becomes very, very damaging to the company. And so I think as VCs, we need to take some ownership of the companies we invest in and help them grow and support them and support their teams and help them to find the best staff and mentor them and support them going forward. To Lucia's point, also from the financial perspective, science doesn't always read the textbook. Those damn mice don't always get cured as well as you think they will, and we need to be prepared for that. So we need to be there to support both monetarily, but also with sound advice and guidance and growth capabilities.
I think that advice is particularly meaningful. Smart money versus dumb money, right? And you're probably seeing that a lot more too, Philip.
Exactly, yes. So a little bit of marketing here. So obviously we are somewhat limited in funds, but how we are trying to compensate for this is it's with our scientific expertise. So if we invest in company, we're going to dig into the most boring graphs and details about the experiments, which we're going to make our own review of the possible indications that they could go on. We will review the biology, everything. So that's how we try to add value to the company, by expertise, not only by internal, but also external. So I think that, especially nowadays, it's extremely important to have dedicated investors, not only, so obviously smart money is a choice, specifically for advanced therapies.
Right. Well, any comments?
Yeah, I agree with everything that's been said, and to maybe add 2 points. I think what we are focusing a lot on is workforce, expertise. How do you build that, right? I mean, if this area is going to grow, we need to also grow the expertise within the area so that it can actually support the companies coming up, right? And actually also workforce to work in the labs. So it's not just expertise, but it's also hands-on kind of capabilities that we're talking about. How do we make sure that that is scaled at the same time so that we can actually do what we want to do? So that's one thing that I think is very, very important on the educational side. And then I completely agree about this, about making sure that the companies that I've said it before, and I'll just say it one more time, the companies that are going on the journey, what can we do to help them have as smooth a ride as possible, right? Many of these companies and many of the people who are in these companies are doing it for the first time. And there's so many mistakes that can be made. It's so much more complex when we're working with cell and gene than in small molecules, for example. So how can we make sure that they are best possibly suited to go on that journey? How can we support them on that journey with expertise as VCs, but also from a foundational point of view? How can we go in and support the ecosystem with closing the gaps that need to be closed, and hands-on go in and support them on that journey, right? And then one final thing that I think that I've heard a lot when I've talked to the investors that I'm closely related to is also that they they have a very keen eye on who you're working with, who you're partnering with. What are the capabilities of your partner? How are they engaging you? Are they just a service provider? Are they a CRO? Are they a CDMO? Or are they actually truly engaging in your project? And why are they the right partner for you to ensure that you have success on your journey, right? And can you answer those questions truthfully, or did you just pick the ones that were cheapest, or were right at the next door, or whatever, right? What was the purpose for you choosing the partners that you've chosen to succeed on your journey?
Right. So flipping the script here, and I probably will have time for one, maybe two burning questions from the audience. So if you have them and start thinking about them, we can come back to them. But flipping the script a little bit, what advice would you give members of the audience who are thinking about how to position their technology, their asset, to investors such as yourselves? Lucia?
Well, the first thing is obviously being very bold in describing what kind of problem you are solving and why, and what you need to do to demonstrate that this works. I've been giving for granted in all of the discussion the fact that you need to have a venture capital that is specialized in the field, because the advantage when you start a startup is the fact that you want to define the shortest way to reach the inflection point, or to decide that your idea doesn't work. And to do that, you cannot afford to build the entire machine of resources internally, but you need to find a financial partner that will help you to bring in the network with all the needed consulting support. So really be bold and be prepared to defend your way to the inflection point, but be also open to listen to the question and suggestion that VCs will give you, educated VCs.
Sven, a tip?
Yeah, I think following on from Lucia, understanding what is the problem you're trying to solve, but then having a very bold vision as to how you're going to solve it. Be able to elucidate that clearly and be able to answer any questions around it. Understand your data, understand where you're trying to go. Don't BS, and be open to saying if you don't have the data. No VC is going to punish you because you haven't done everything. Make sure you know what needs to be done, what you have done, what you need to do, and be open to those questions and the discussions around it. I think understand your direction, where you're going, understand what the costs are going to be. Don't make up costs. Make sure you have costed things out. And then my personal favorite, do not overpromise and underdeliver. Under any circumstances, always underpromise and overdeliver.
No, great comment. Anything to add?
Probably from my side, we've seen recently that a lot of companies in preclinical stage are trying to raise by the lower bar of what they need. Maybe that's not the best idea. So you need to go and raise exactly how much you need. So don't try to reduce costs. So for us, it's better to be a part of a bigger round and reach some kind of an inflection point than find out that we are in a situation where we don't have like 3 to 4 million to reach something, but we could account it at the start. So we see a lot of this right now, but I think it's not the best idea.
Yeah, being the last one, everything's
Yeah,
already
exactly.
been said, right? But maybe I'll just say I see the same dynamics as I see in other fields, but maybe it's just amplified in cell and gene, right? So when we talk about the team, for example, it's just even more important than it is in other fields. When you're looking for investors, will look at your team. Is it the right team? Are they the right partners and things like that, right? So maybe I'll just add that and say, keep an eye on that. Are you working with the right people to make sure that you have success? I think that's important.
So at the risk of backtracking from what I offered to the audience with questions, we are getting short of time, so I'm going to close this out and invite everybody to speak to our panelists, maybe during the break or find them during the course of the meeting. With that, I'm going to ask each of you one last question. I'll go down the line, starting with you, Bo, and come back towards me. Can you make a prediction about 2024 that you might think will surprise the audience?
surprise them. Yeah, it's really difficult, right? But I think we will actually see clinical data on regenerative medicine that will surprise us. That shows that it has effect, which will maybe have a positive effect on the whole field.
Great. Philip?
So I would like to add about the field. So we are really excited in 2024 about cardiovascular space, most of it. Also CNS is always blossoming, and personally for me, it's like delivery. And so specifically non-viral, if you can. So probably that's it. But we expect yeah.
Right, Sven, your prediction?
I expect and hope to be surprised by groups coming out with a better understanding of disease pathology. I think to date, our disease pathology understanding has been at too high a level. It's been more symptomatic and it's been more systemic. And I think there's a lot of work going on trying to look at it at the molecular level. And I think we'll see some interesting data coming out there, and that will also help us to design better therapies for patients.
Great. Lucia?
Now, very difficult. I hope I will be surprised, let's put it in this way, but I would really like to see a change from a regulatory legislative point of view in Europe that would allow an acceleration in the field.
There we go.
Right. Well, my prediction is that Max Verstappen will win. No, never mind. I'll leave us there, though. Everybody, please join me in thanking the panelists. Thanks for a very engaging discussion.
Thank you, Phil.
Thank you very much to all of you. Thanks. And I guess, like most good raising companies, I'll just finish with check, please. All right. Thank you.